Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Cohen, the author of An Introduction to the Art and Science of Chinese Tea Ceremony. Today, we're discussing Book 2, Chapter 6, The Minds of Yixing, and Chapter 6, Section 1, The Three Strata of Zisha Ore. Here to talk about this chapter is our editorial team, Patrick Penny.
Hey, hey.
And Zongzun Li.
Hello.
Hello, Pat. Hello, Zongzun. This chapter discusses the specific mines of Yixing, the ore found within the mines, the developmental history of mining in China, and the development of specific mines. The knowledge contained in this chapter and its subsections are notably difficult to apply. Enough so that I actually wrote a disclaimer within the introduction. Why is that so? Why is it so difficult to apply the knowledge of mining to the formation and use of Yixing teapots?
For one thing, it's very rare that you actually have verifiable knowledge of the either ore that was used, right, or the mine that ore came from for any teapot that you get your hands on in application. It's very rare for the merchant to truly and verifiably know, these informations as fact. And so while we can provide the rudimentary, right, knowledge to form the frameworks that you need to understand these mines, the strata, the clay, the eventual ore, and how it is, turned into a pot from there. It's so hard to verify that what you get in your hands speaks to any of that framework.
Yeah, and also furthermore, different region, different types of mines, and different period of time, you oftentimes end up having, scholars or miners utilizing different systems to classify the ores or the materials that they use to make teapots. So that can be very confusing, and same terms or different terms gets used for the same ore in different period of time, or even sometimes in the same period of time. So that needs to be verified, but also sometimes impossible to verify. So we are trying our best in the book to try to sort out all of the details and the history behind all these terminologies. Hopefully, we are not making things more confusing.
So to summarize, Pat, you said that most of the time we only know the clay, not the mine that the clay came from, or the subtype of clay. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
How much does it matter? Isn't there just duani, luni, hongni, zini? What else do we need to know?
Right. Well, it depends on what you, as the user of the teapot, want that knowledge for, right? Is it to better understand what you own? Is it to share, right, the phenomenological experience with people participating in drinking your tea with you? I think the first thing that I think about is, what is that knowledge for? And so for me, when I get my hands on a teapot, I'm trying to understand how this clay is interacting with my technique and the tea, and how it's all coming together to help me brew the best cup of tea possible. And so if you know the type of clay, but you don't understand where it came from, or maybe how it was processed, while we might call the clays the same thing, there can be material differences between clays coming from different strata, even if they are the same clay type, coming from different locations, right? And it goes back to what we talked about in the previous chapter and on the podcast about, the basically surface topology of the ore and finished clay having a large impact on the tea brewing. And so clay from different strata or different regions is likely to have different surface roughness and different surface topology.
Yeah, I just want to weigh in on Pat's points, because I find it very tangible to a lot of the research that we have done. For certain types of clay, even if the outer appearance of the ores look, almost identical, you can, end up having very different quality teapots at the end of the day. So depending on, the mineral composition, depending on the weathering condition of the ore, the sintering temperature can be different, the surface roughness can be different, which eventually will result into, the quality of the teapot being different.
Right. It's possible to have the same type of clay or the same named clay, and potentially one was above a yellow stone layer and one was below a yellow stone layer, right? And you can have very different material that was filtered, and while the naming convention may be the same, the chemical and physical composition of that clay, when it eventually is processed, or when it's eventually processed into clay, can be very, very different, as you said, Zongzun.
Yep, correct.
Speaking of naming systems or names being the same or different, Zongzun, your point was that different systems of classification existed over time or even at the same time. One of the things that we spoke quite a bit about in the first book, and then we reference a number of times in this book, is that the Neo-Confucius ideal of Gewu, of first-hand knowledge, going out and collecting your own information, right, can be seen as an early form of empirical knowledge, a change from cited knowledge, a change from taking knowledge of prior writings from prior individuals who write about what they heard, and individuals actually going out and doing their own research and seeing things for themselves. And that led to an intermixing of classes. We had literates and scholars going out and talking to miners, which was an unusual thing to do before that. So why did these different systems exist? Where did the systems come from? And why didn't everyone use the same system?
That's a very interesting question. Different systems, they exist in the first place to serve the user's purpose, right? Like for miners, they might be just calling all of the ores that they found with, black particles mixing between zhima luni, sesame luni, or zhima some kind of ni. But in nature, it might be very different in terms of its chemical composition or its formation, geologic formation, which is more useful for, geologists or Yixing experts to better understand what they're dealing with. So I think one of the key reasons why there are so many systems being used throughout the time is because we have many different parties, participating in the whole Yixing industry. We have the miners, we have the ceramists, we have the scholars, like people that mine the clay, people that use the clay, and people that use the end product of the clay. So that's why there are so many systems exist, in different region and also in different time.
And did all of those individuals have the same goal, or were their goals tangential to each other?
Probably tangential to certain degrees, but at the end of the day, what they're dealing with or what their expectation is, totally different, between a miner or, a scholar drinking a Yixing teapot.
Who formed the system of classifications? Were the miners sitting around writing poetic, clearly not iambic pentameter, were they writing poetic couplets?
Lots of limericks about Yixing clay, yeah.
Gotta write a rhythm.
Man from Yixing. Right. So who was doing the writing?
Yeah, it's the same people who are always doing the writing throughout history. So I think, in the late Ming and the Qing, particularly the literati, right, of that time are getting together, discussing as they learn more from this evidentiary scholarship, discussing together as a group and coming up with this common language and this framework. It's their writing that persists throughout time. It's their writing that, from the, let's say maybe potentially the merchant class all the way up through the imperial family would be having some kind of influence bidirectionally. And it's their writing that to this day is, able to be researched and delved through for you guys to parse out what's important and write it in this book.
One of the things we touch on in these chapters, but we get into more in the developmental history of mining, is how the government actually promoted some of the mandarins, some of the scholar officials, to write the books. Mining itself was an incredibly important industry, and mining knowledge was originally guarded by individual groups who believed that they could gain a competitive advantage from trade secrets on how to mine, how to construct mines. The government, to some extent, put an end to that and said actually the mining information had to be shared with the local officials so that the local officials could take what's best and what's working within the mines and move those to additional areas to increase productivity. And part of that was actually done in the gazetteers that went out and were freely available for reading. Why didn't that become the standard for the classification of Yixing ore? Why did all of these different classifications exist even when the government had a hand in the propagation of mining knowledge?
I bet there's something to do with the early on literacy of general public back in the days, because at late ROC, early PRC, you still have the mass majority of the public not be able to read or write. That's why, the simplification movement of Chinese character was pushed by the government to help increase the literacy rate of the public.
I agree with that, with the exchange of knowledge between literati and the miners. One of the things that I was thinking about is that the government's incentive and the government's goal was purely on productivity, right? Construct mines, make the mines slightly safer so that fewer people died via mine collapse. But, it was not particularly interested in the specific outputs of the mines on an individual basis. It wasn't writing about the ore from Yixing being extracted out of the mine. It was predominantly interested in copper and tin and more important commodities at a governmental level. And so the government had an interest in saying this is how to construct a mine so it doesn't flood and it doesn't collapse. And here's new technology to extract things from the mine. But I don't think that they really then wrote about, well, actually in Yixing, right, here's the ores from these mines and here's the ores for that mine, right? That was really done by the Southern literati that gained a preference for Yixing teapots and began to codify a system of knowledge.
Yeah, I agree. And also, throughout the time, you see technology advancement being applied throughout, shaft mine number 1 to shaft mine number 5. And the mining of these shaft mines or some other open pit mines in, for example, like Taishi village, extend to a very long period of time. So probably a lot of workers are no longer working in Yixing in different mines, which they might adopt into different naming systems.
Do you have any examples of applying mine knowledge to your selection of Yixing ware?
I don't think so.
That was a very unfair question. I was having trouble thinking of it. I think I might have 2 examples. One, well, we've commissioned now some Yixing teapots and we knew the specific mines. I don't know if that's really considered applied other than picking one mine versus another mine or examining the ore. The one area of applied knowledge that is to some smaller extent come into play for me is looking at F1 or very early F1 Yixing teapots, particularly from the Free Period versus the Cultural Revolution period, where in the Cultural Revolution period, the mines began to get deeper and you get to see types of clay that were previously had not yet been unearthed, particularly with the mechanization of the mining. It's hard to say how much I would attribute the ability to identify the very early F1 wares to that. I think firing is probably more helpful for me and effects of firing, but certainly some level of knowledge there has been helpful. But I really do struggle to think about anything, any other examples of using the mine knowledge and actively in choosing Yixing teapots or in acquiring Yixing teapots.
I don't think that it's impossible to apply that knowledge. I would say that I think I still am in the phase of learning and accumulating enough of that knowledge and seeing enough examples, because I think you write as much in the book that reading this framework and starting to mentally build up the picture will require a lot of hands-on examples. And while I think we've had a lot of chances to get really good, well-validated examples of different clays, different pots from materials that came from specific mines, I still think it's a framework that's very much in development for me.
What you're saying is I need to commission a lot more Yixing teapots.
Yeah, definitely.
So turning now to mining and the ore itself, the mining of zisha ore can be a confusing topic. We've referred to zisha as ore because it's a more solid rock-like material. Zisha ore itself is found embedded with and surrounded by clay which is not considered part of the zisha category. That not zisha clay falls into horizontal parallel bands called strata, stacked on top of each other. Different zisha ores, such as zini, duani, and hongni, are found in different strata. How do those clay bands form, and why is that important in understanding the formation of zisha ore?
It's time for geology class. When we just think about the earth and the buildup of strata from which these ores are going to be found within, material, obviously, that is found closer to the surface is younger by the law of superposition, right? Material that is found further, deeper towards the core of the earth is going to be older material. As the continents have moved and as oceans have, flown, we have different layering of different sediments. And over time, you'll have sediments build up on top of each other, forming distinct bands or patterns. And things like the ocean tides and rivers and volcanoes are all going to affect, how materials are deposited on top of these layers. And so you have different layers of deposition, and then within and on top of those layers, you have weathering that will happen, right, to them. From this both depositing of material and weathering of material, we get the formation of different strata. From within, specifically talking about Yixing, we get the strata that you discuss within the book, which are the nenni, the baini, and the jiani strata, around and within which we find the named ores that we're interested in as teapot users for zisha Yixing clay. Do I get an A on my geology test?
Yeah, that was a solid A answer. Particularly thinking about the sedimentary nature, right? Secondary sedimentary clay, you have materials that are moved from their place of origin as rock, they're weathered down, they're deposited, and then they settle into these layers, and then those layers get further weathering. So if all of these layers are moving together, if the mass of the layers are moving together, why is some of it clay and some of it ore?
It's probably going to deal with, the weathering effect of the formation of or the composition. For the ores, they are usually in more condensed format, harder than average. And for the more clay-rich matters being mined from different regions, they're usually being more weathered due to rainfall or the rise or retreat of Lake Taihu over the course of time. So I think that's one of the main factors. I'm not sure if Patrick, you have anything to add?
No, I think it just brings us back to the previous chapters where we kind of went through the descriptions of what is Yixing or zisha ore versus what is the clays of Yixing.
Exactly. Are those strata usable for anything?
Yeah, I think you have good examples in the book actually of flower pots and other various kind of ornamental materials that the clays were used for. But and I do think maybe baini is the only example that you have tea wares that are made out of, at least examples within the book. But I think by and large, there's not a lot of fine teaware that's found made from the clays of those strata.
But to clarify, so jiani, baini, and nenni, the jiani is made into things like flower pots and other utilitarian wares. Nenni is made into flower pots and other utilitarian wares, and baini can be made into teaware.
Yeah,
correct.
And how did the economics of mining Yixing change with the manufacture of cheap and readily available plastic?
Well, I don't know the answer, but I would assume that if you can get something that is cheap and lightweight to be used as your utilitarian ware versus something that has to be mined and processed and shaped by an artisan or at least a craftsman, such as, a Yixing flower pot versus a plastic flower pot. Either one of two things can happen. Most people will shift to the plastic, and maybe people with more money may still choose to utilize the clay, or I don't know if I actually have much of an or there. I think it could either increase the price or decrease the price depending on how the economics flow.
And I think that people's perception of wares made out of Yixing clay or clay wares in general has shifted over the past few decades due to the mass industrialization movements. By and large, right, like mining of Yixing is essentially a byproduct of mining jiani, nenni, or baini. All the mass production of daily usage wares were made out of the mining of these materials in the early days. It was till later on that, especially in the PRC era, when people start to find more usage of all of these zisha wares that are byproducts of mining of nenni or jiani. So in the very early days, people's perception of wares made out of Yixing clay in general is probably going to be something that's cheap for daily usage. But right now, when people are thinking about Yixing clay, they will probably think about Yixing teapot, higher end products, and all that, because the consumption of Yixing teapot or the usage of Yixing clay has changed over the past few decades.
Yeah, the advent of cheap mass manufactured plastic decreased the economic incentive for the mining of Yixing clay, both Yixing clay and Yixing ore. It made it much more expensive because there wasn't a readily available set of buyers for the byproducts anymore. My last question, what's the most surprising thing you've learned in these last two sections?
Since I wasn't part of the research phase of this book, the existence of nenni, baini, and jiani was totally unknown to me. My thought of how Yixing clay mining worked right, or mining worked, was that people were going into a mine and, they'd mentally, I'm seeing pickaxes, but they're walking into the mine with a pickaxe and, oh, there's a nice, stalactite looking thing of hongni. And all you got to do is chop that and there's your hongni, And so I think just the presence, right, of these strata and the presence of the named ore kind of existing as material within these strata, right, present at different layers, was just not something that I had understood in my framework of how the Yixing zisha mining worked. So it was all quite new to me. Really, really enlightening.
Yeah, definitely the relationship of jiani and nenni and all different kinds of zishas are quite fascinating, even during the research phase. In the beginning, we often hear people talking a lot about, oh, this is from, certain nenni mine, this is from jiani mine, but, this is a zhuni, this is a zisha, a zini, or this is a luni. So the relationship between, all these different kind of clays are fascinating to research about. And it will be heavily investigated and talked about in the later chapter of this book.
Jason, when you were writing this chapter, what surprised you through either your research or as you were starting to synthesize your writings?
I guess what surprised me is how complicated the mining and then processing of Yixing ore is. You think to yourself, well, here's a gigantic deposit of usable ceramic clay, and this ceramic clay produces nice usable wares. And somehow they said, well, actually, this clay, this is not the best clay. These rock-like things that we need to pound and sort and re-weather and then soak and then filter and then mash, right? All of these processing steps in order to take it from ore into clay, when it's surrounded by usable clay. And you think to yourself, why and how did they ever figure this out? How did you get to the point where they said, well, actually, this clay is really not as good as other clays with this rock-like substance. We can take this and turn that into better clay, right? Where did that knowledge, where did that desire come from? Who was the first person to take a chunk of surface level Yixing ore and try to process it into Yixing clay? I think that's the most surprising thing. When you think to yourself, they kind of somewhat ignored or sorted out this readily available and usable clay for this very difficult to use ore. That's really the most surprising thing.
And I don't know that we ever really get a true answer to that, right? I guess somebody must have been willing to pay more for economics must have come into it somehow, but there may never really be a way to know the truth.
Some of the knowledge must come from elsewhere in China, right? There was other places that didn't have readily usable clay that they figured out how to take some harder rocks and process them into clay, right? That knowledge had to exist out of necessity somewhere else and had been brought to Yixing, but I don't think we'll know that story.
No, there's another answer. And this is a auditory medium, but aliens. And I've got my hands up.
I think you had a more viable theory, Zongzun. Go ahead.
No. Well, I just want to say that, really all these research of these mines and mining techniques and processing techniques bring us a new level of appreciation that goes into the scholarship and artisanal value of Yixing wares, because oftentimes it's easy for us to appreciate the value of Yixing artists, ceramic artists, but there are a lot of other things that goes into perfecting a piece of claywares that were made out of these random rocks that are buried underground.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us in this edition of Tea Technique Editorial Conversations. Please join us again for our next conversation, Developmental History of Yixing Mining.